I pressed my ear against the wall of my father's study the night everything changed. I wasn't snooping. I was coming to tell him dinner was ready. My aunt had made pot roast, the kind she only makes when she's trying to smooth something over, and I heard my name. Not my full name. Just her. The way you say her when you don't want to dignify someone with the effort of a name. Her, my uncle said. You're actually considering giving her a share? My father's chair creaked. I knew that sound. He leaned back in it when he was about to say something he'd already decided on. No, he said. Nadia gets nothing. That's final. I stood there in the hallway with my hands still raised to knock, and I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not the dramatic kind of quiet you see in movies, where everything slows down and the music swells. Just quiet, like a door closing softly in a room you didn't realize you'd been living in. I walked back to the kitchen. I told my aunt dinner was almost ready. I set the table for 6 people, including a place for myself, and I sat down and passed the bread rolls when they came around, and I smiled when my cousin told a story about his new apartment in Austin, and the whole time, underneath all of it, I was thinking, okay, so that's how it is. My name is Nadia. I'm 31 years old. I have a master's degree in accounting from UNC, 7 years of professional experience, and for the past 4 of those years, I've been the one quietly keeping my family's company from going under. The company is called Hartwell Property Group. My grandfather started it in Charlotte in 1978, residential and commercial real estate development. Nothing flashy, just steady and solid and built on relationships. By the time my father took over, it had grown to about 40 employees and a portfolio worth somewhere north of $80 million. Not generational wealth of billionaires' money, but real money. The kind of money that, divided properly, would have meant security for everyone. My older sister's name is Brianna. She's 35, she has a real estate license she got 6 years ago and has used maybe 3 times, and she has never once in her adult life worked inside the company. She lives 40 minutes away in a house my parents helped her buy, drives a car my parents co-signed for, and calls my father every Sunday morning to tell him what a wonderful job he's doing. I, on the other hand, have worked at Hartwell since I was 27. I came in as a junior financial analyst, worked my way up to director of finance, and in 2023 I was the one who found, almost by accident, that something was very wrong with the books. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For a long time I told myself the favoritism was just a feeling. Family dynamics are complicated. My sister was born first. She had a different relationship with my parents. Maybe I was reading into things. People do that. They see patterns that aren't there. Except the patterns were there. My sister got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a card and a gas station gift card. My sister's college tuition was paid in full, no questions asked. I got 2 years covered, and then my father sat me down and explained that the business needs liquidity right now and suggested I look into student loans, which I did and which I paid off myself over the next 5 years. My sister's wedding had a budget of $40,000. My father wrote the check without blinking. When I told my parents I was engaged, briefly, at 28, to a man named Owen, who turned out to be allergic to commitment, my mother said, "Well, weddings are so expensive, you two should really think about whether a big ceremony is necessary." We eloped. It didn't last, but that's a different story. The point is, I knew. I'd known for a long time. I just kept showing up anyway because the work was real and the company mattered and my grandfather had built something worth protecting. And someone had to care about that. The night I heard my father's voice through that study door, my grandfather had been dead for 3 months. He passed in August. A stroke, quick. The doctor said he probably didn't feel much. He was 81 and sharp until the end. The kind of man who could recite the square footage of every property he'd ever developed and tell you exactly which contractor had given him trouble on each one. He called me 2 weeks before he died and asked me to walk him through the Q2 financials over the phone. I did. He said, "You're the one who actually understands this business, Nadia." Then he asked me how my knee was doing. I'd had a minor surgery in June and told me to eat more protein. That was the last real conversation we had. His will was, I thought, straightforward. The estate was to be divided between my father and his brother, my uncle Raymond. The company ownership would transfer to my father, with the understanding that he would manage it as a going concern. There were some specific bequests for grandchildren. He'd mentioned to me, more than once, that he'd set something aside for me specifically. Not just the general grandchildren's trust, but something separate to acknowledge my work at the company. I didn't know the exact amount. I didn't ask. It felt crass to ask. He was my grandfather and I loved him, and the money was secondary. After he died, my father and Uncle Raymond had a series of closed-door meetings with the estate attorney. I wasn't invited. Neither was my cousin Dara, who was Uncle Raymond's daughter and the only other person in our generation who'd ever worked seriously in the business. She'd done project management for 2 years before moving to Denver. I asked my father once, casually, how the estate process was going. He said, "It's being handled." That was in September. By November, the night of the pot roast dinner, the night I stood in the hallway, I had my answer. The thing about being the person who understands the finances is that you see things other people miss. I've been noticing small discrepancies for about 18 months. Nothing dramatic. A vendor payment that didn't match its invoice. A contract fee logged twice in the same quarter. Reimbursement requests for travel that I couldn't match to any project timeline. Each one, individually, looked like a bookkeeping error. Together, over time, they started to look like something else. I didn't say anything right away. I told myself I was probably wrong. I told myself there were explanations. I told myself that accusing your own father of financial misconduct, based on a hunch, was not something you did lightly. But after the night in the hallway, something shifted. I went into the office the next Monday and I started pulling records. Not anything I didn't have access to. I was director of finance. I had access to everything. I started cross-referencing vendor accounts against our registered supplier list. I pulled the bank reconciliations going back 2 years. I requested copies of wire transfer authorizations that I knew should have been co-signed, but that I had never personally reviewed. It took me 3 weeks to understand what I was looking at. There was a company called Meridian Advisory Group that had been receiving quarterly payments from Hartwell for the past 2 years. Payments logged as consulting fees, averaging around $18,000 per quarter. That's $72,000 a year. Over 2 years, $144,000. I could not find any contract with Meridian Advisory Group. I could not find any deliverable, any report, any evidence that Meridian Advisory Group had advised us on anything. When I searched the LLC registry for North Carolina, I found that Meridian Advisory Group had been registered in 2021 with a single registered agent, a name I didn't recognize, at a P.O. box in Concord. When I searched that registered agent's name in our own internal HR system, I found nothing. When I searched it in our vendor onboarding files, I found nothing. When I hired a private research service, using my own money, $280, to run a background search on the name, I found that the registered agent had the same birthday as my Uncle Raymond, lived 3 blocks from his house in Mooresville, and had been his college roommate at NC State. I sat with that information for a full week before I did anything else. There's a particular kind of loneliness in knowing something you can't say out loud yet. You go about your day, you answer emails, you review project budgets, you eat lunch at your desk and answer your phone and smile at the receptionist on your way out, and the whole time you're carrying this thing that nobody else can see. I thought about going to my father directly. I ran through that conversation in my head probably 50 times. I always got to the same place. He would deny it, explain it away, and I would lose any advantage I had. Worse, he might tip off Uncle Raymond, and whatever documentation existed might disappear. I thought about going to a lawyer first. That felt right, but I didn't know what kind of lawyer. I didn't want to call the wrong person and have it get back to anyone before I was ready. I had a friend from graduate school named Vivienne. Wait, I'm not supposed to use that name. A friend. I'll call her my grad school friend. She'd gone into forensic accounting and worked for a firm in Raleigh that dealt specifically with financial fraud cases. We'd stayed in touch, the way you do with people who survived grad school alongside you. Occasional texts, a dinner when she came through Charlotte, a phone call when either of us was stressed. I texted her on a Tuesday afternoon. "Are you around this week? I need to talk to someone about something work-related. Off the record." She called me back within an hour. I told her what I'd found. She asked me to send her the documentation, just the Meridian files, nothing else. She came back to me 2 days later and said, "Nadia, this isn't bookkeeping errors. This is a shell company. You need to talk to a white-collar attorney before you do anything else." She gave me a name. I made an appointment. The attorney's name was Gordon. His office was in uptown Charlotte, on the 22nd floor of a building I'd walked past 100 times. He had the kind of calm that I imagined came from 2 decades of sitting across from people in the worst moments of their financial lives. I laid everything out. He asked precise, methodical questions. He took notes. At the end of an hour, he said, "Based on what you've described, you potentially have evidence of wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and possibly tax evasion, depending on how Meridian filed. This is serious." He told me not to remove any original documents from the company servers. He told me to continue documenting my access logs so there would be a record that I had legitimate reason to view everything I'd viewed. He told me not to confront my father or uncle. He told me to come back in 2 weeks with everything I had organized and indexed. I went home that night and I sat in my apartment in Noda and I looked at the framed photo of my grandfather on my bookshelf. He's standing in front of the first commercial building Hartwell ever developed. A small retail strip in Matthews. Nothing impressive, but he's smiling like he's just won something. I said out loud to the empty room, "I'm going to take care of it." The next 6 weeks were the longest of my life in a way that was also, strangely, very quiet. I kept showing up to work. I kept doing my job. I reviewed the Q3 financials, prepared the year-end forecast, sat through 3 project update meetings, and ordered birthday cake for the office when our project coordinator turned 40. I spoke to my father exactly 4 times, twice on work matters, once when he called to ask if I was coming to Thanksgiving, once when I called to say I wasn't. He didn't ask why. He said, "All right," and got off the phone quickly. I think he had somewhere to be. My sister called me the week before Thanksgiving and told me I was being dramatic and that family was family regardless of whatever business stuff was going on. I said I had plans and wished her a good holiday. She said, "This is so you, Nadia," which I didn't fully understand but also didn't ask her to explain. Gordon had been in contact with the North Carolina Secretary of State's office and had flagged the Meridian situation to the state's Financial Crimes Division. It wasn't an FBI referral, not yet, but it was moving. A forensic accounting firm he worked with, separate from my grad school friend's employer, had been brought in to do an independent audit of the last 3 years of Hartwell's books. The audit took 4 weeks. What they found was worse than what I'd found. Meridian was the largest piece, but not the only piece. There were 2 other shell entities, one registered in Delaware, one in South Carolina, that had been receiving payments from Hartwell over a 5-year period. The total, across all 3, was somewhere in the range of $640,000. A portion of it appeared to run through Uncle Raymond's personal accounts. A smaller portion, this was the part that made me put the report down and stare at the wall for a while. A smaller portion appeared to have flowed through a joint account that my father held with my Uncle Raymond, into a separate personal brokerage account that was not disclosed as a company asset. My father knew. Maybe I'd always known he knew. But seeing it in a financial document, laid out in clean columns, was different. I want to say that I felt righteous, or powerful, or something that sounds like a good story. What I actually felt was tired. A very specific kind of tired that I think only happens when you've been hoping, for a long time, that you were wrong about something, and you finally stop hoping. Gordon told me the case was strong. He told me that the state had enough to open a formal investigation, which they did in January tightly, with no announcement, the way those things start. He told me that my cooperation had been central to building the record. He told me that as a company officer who had not participated in the fraud and had in fact brought it to light, I was in a protected position. He also told me something I hadn't thought to think about, that my grandfather's will, combined with the evidence of fraud, created a potential basis for a civil suit against my father and uncle for breach of fiduciary duty to the estate. Your grandfather, Gordon said, clearly intended for you to receive a specific bequest. The fact that you were verbally excluded from the estate distribution, in the context of a fraud scheme that appears to have been designed to liquidate company assets before they could be distributed, that matters. He said it carefully. Lawyer carefully. But I understood what he meant. The investigation moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, which I think is how all of these things go. In February, my father was contacted by the State Financial Crimes Division. I know this because he called me 3 days later. It was the first time he'd called me 3 days later. It was the first time he'd called me since November. "Nadia," he said, "I need to know if you've spoken to anyone about company financial records." I said, "I've spoken to my attorney." Long pause. "Your attorney," he said. "Yes." Another pause. This is This is going to affect the whole family. You understand that? I understand that there's been significant fraud committed against Hartwell Property Group, I said. I understand that my grandfather built that company, and I understand that I have a legal and professional obligation to report financial misconduct when I find it. He said, "You are making a serious mistake." I said, "I disagree." He hung up. My sister called me that night at 9:30. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the voicemail, which was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long and contained the words selfish, obsessed, and "you've always wanted to burn this family down." I saved the voicemail to a cloud folder labeled documentation because at that point I was documenting everything out of habit. What I didn't do, and I want to be clear about this, was go to any family member's house. I did not confront my uncle. I did not attend any of the 3 family meetings that were apparently convened over the following weeks, based on secondhand information from my cousin Dara, who texted me from Denver to say she'd also been excluded from the estate and that she was watching what you're doing and quietly rooting for you. That text meant more to me than I had words for. The civil case was filed in March. It named my father and uncle as defendants and sought recovery of the fraudulently transferred assets plus damages against the estate. The state investigation was ongoing and separate, but it ran parallel. I won't pretend any of it felt good. Discovery is not cinematic. It's documents and depositions and long calls with your attorney to discuss procedural timelines. It's sitting in a conference room across from your father's lawyer and answering questions while your father sits at the end of the table and doesn't look at you. The one time he did look at me, directly, across the conference room table, I looked back. I didn't look away first. I don't think I would have been able to explain what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even anger. It was just something like clarity. Like seeing something exactly as it was, without the filter of wanting it to be different. The settlement was reached in June. My father and Uncle Raymond did not go to prison. That outcome is rarer than people think, especially in first-time financial fraud cases involving family businesses where the cooperation of a key witness, me, had already been critical to the state's record. They agreed to full repayment of the fraudulently transferred assets with interest through a structured payment plan over 5 years. They lost their ownership positions in Hartwell. A receiver was appointed to manage the company during the transition. The civil case resulted in the recovery of my grandfather's intended bequest to me, based on a document his estate attorney produced, a handwritten amendment he'd been in the process of formalizing when he died, which specified $112,000 to be set aside for me specifically. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was his. And it was real. The company itself survived. It needed new leadership, significant restructuring, and a painful but necessary transparency audit. The board, which had been essentially dormant under my father's management, was reconstituted with independent members. I was asked to stay on as a financial consultant during the transition, a role I accepted on a short-term contract basis while I figured out what came next. In July, I drove out to Matthews. I parked in front of the retail strip my grandfather had developed in 1981. It's a nail salon and an insurance office and a small tax prep place now. Not glamorous, but still standing, still occupied, still doing what it was built to do. I sat in the car for a while. It was 93 degrees, and I had the AC running, and I thought about my grandfather standing in front of that building, smiling. He'd built something real. He'd trusted the wrong people to take care of it, which happens, which is maybe the most common tragedy in family businesses. Not malice from strangers, but ordinary failure from the people closest to you. But it was still standing. I called Dara that afternoon. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," I said. "Hey," she said. "How are you?" "I'm okay," I said. "I think I might actually be okay." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "He would have been proud of you, you know, your grandfather. He really would have." I didn't say anything for a moment. The AC hummed. Outside, someone walked out of the nail salon and put on sunglasses. "I know," I said. "I think he would have." My sister and I have not spoken since March. I don't know if we ever will or what that conversation would even look like. Some doors, once they close, stay closed. Not out of cruelty, but just because there's nothing left to open them with. My father and I are not in contact. I imagine that might change, someday, in the way that things sometimes soften with enough time and distance. Or it might not. I've stopped trying to control which one it turns out to be. What I know is this. I woke up most of my adult life in a house where the message, spoken or not, was that I was less than, less deserving, less important, less real. And for a long time I responded to that message by working harder and asking less and telling myself that the work itself was enough. It wasn't enough. But it did give me the tools. And in the end, it wasn't my father who got to decide what I was worth. It was me. It was always going to be me. I just needed to finally believe that. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to do something like what I did. People hear the outcome, the settlement, the recovered money, the fraud exposed, and they imagine it must have felt powerful. Like a scene from a movie where the music swells and the camera pulls back wide. It didn't feel like that. It felt like sitting alone in my apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, staring at a spreadsheet and deciding, one more time, not to close the laptop. That's the part nobody talks about, not the courage it takes to confront someone, because I never did confront anyone. Not dramatically. Not the way you picture it. The courage was smaller than that. It was showing up to work the next morning after I heard my father's voice through that study door. It was eating Thanksgiving alone that year, and not letting myself pretend that was okay when it wasn't. It was making the call to Gordon's office even though I was shaking a little when I dialed, because I was still, after everything, hoping I'd found some innocent explanation I'd missed. I hadn't. And I think I'd known that for a long time before I was willing to say it. Here's what I've come to understand about the way things actually work. Underneath all the noise, what you do, consistently, over time, shapes what becomes possible for you. Not in a greeting card way. In a very literal, practical way. I spent years building skills, accounting, analysis, documentation, pattern recognition, because the work mattered to me and because I respected my grandfather's vision for that company. I wasn't building a case. I was just doing my job carefully and honestly, because that's who I was trying to be. And then, when it mattered, I had exactly what I needed. My father and uncle had spent years doing the opposite, taking small amounts at first, probably, the way these things usually start, just enough to feel like a gray area, then more, then more, then structuring it carefully enough that they thought no one would ever find the thread. What they didn't account for was that the one person with full access to the finances was also the one person they'd written off as unimportant. That's the thing about treating people as less than. You stop seeing them clearly, and when you stop seeing someone clearly, you stop accounting for what they're capable of. I'm not saying my sister is a bad person. I genuinely don't know what she knew or didn't know. And I've decided it's not mine to determine. What I know is that the story she told herself, that I was difficult, dramatic, always making things about me, kept her from asking questions she should have asked. That story cost her something too in the end, just not the same things it cost me. Dara texted me last month. She's doing well in Denver. We're talking about getting coffee the next time she's in Charlotte. I still have the photo of my grandfather on my bookshelf. I still look at it sometimes. What I took from all of this, the real thing underneath the legal proceedings and the financial recovery, is that integrity is not something that pays off immediately. It's not a strategy. It's just a way of being that, over enough time, becomes the only thing left standing when everything else gets pulled away. My grandfather had it. I tried to have it. And when the moment came where it was the only tool I had, it turned out to be enough. That's not a guarantee. I know that. Things could have gone differently. The documents could have been destroyed. The investigation could have stalled. The civil case could have failed. Doing the right thing doesn't come with a warranty. But I'd still do it the same way. Every time.